What's up, YouTube? On this video, we'll be doing the front suspension. So we'll be doing the front coil springs, the shocks, and the sway bar, along with the rear sway bar. So let's get it. We will also be converting the front drum brakes to disc brakes. So we're going to be going with 6-piston Brembos, but that will be on the next video. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to disassemble the front hub and remove the parking brake and the hub and the rest of the parking brake assembly. So once you get to the backing plate, there'll be 3 bolts that hold the backing plate on. The top one's a bigger size than the bottom ones. And then you'll have the brake line that goes to the back of the little drum. So make sure you remove that. And then everything should come off. So once you remove that, you have 2 options. You can either remove the upper ball joint nut or the bottom ball joint nut. We're going to go with the upper on this side. So once you remove the cotter pin from the upper ball joint, you want to put a floor jack underneath the lower control arm. So that when you loosen up the nut, the ball joint and the lower control arm doesn't go flying out, and then the spring comes flying out at you. So after we break the nut loose, we're going to screw it back on just a couple of threads. And then we're going to lower the floor jack just about 1 inch or 2. So that way when we break the steering knuckle from the ball joint, it doesn't have too much pressure on the nut, and it's like a backup feature. And then we're going to use a hammer to break the ball joint loose from the knuckle. And then you see how I just shut out? Now if you didn't have this here or this here, it would have went, well, at least that was shut down. This part wouldn't have flown off. So next up, Don Slick is gonna work on taking out the front sway bar. So there's two bolts on each side that hold the sway bar to the frame, and then there's tire or sway bar endings that hold the sway bar to the lower control arm. So we're gonna remove those real quick. And once the sway bar is out of the way, we could remove the old shocks. They might be rusted or have a bunch of shit on them, so you want to like clean up the threads if you can on the top. You got to hold the nut and hold the top piece and then break the nut loose. Once you take the nut off on the top of the shock, on the bottom there will be 2 bolts, so you have to hold the bolt and then take the nut off. So on the driver's side, we're gonna do the same thing, but instead we're gonna take off the cotter pin off the lower ball joint, and then we're gonna take off the nut, and again we're gonna put it on just a couple of threads just to hold it in place while we knock out the ball joint. So once the ball joint is loose with the jack underneath it, we'll take off the nut and then slowly lower the lower control arm so that way the spring doesn't come flying out. And on the driver's side, we'll finish removing the bottom part of the shock. And then once the shock drops out, we should be able to pull the spring out. There. So now you're going to firmly grab the bottom of the spring, and with someone pulling down on the lower control arm, you're going to pull the spring up towards you and pull it out of the socket. So here's a comparison of the spring that we're pulling out, and we're placing it with the UMI 2-inch lowering spring. You can see there's a huge height difference. So now is a good time to make sure it's clean where the pocket sits at, and there's a groove here where the spring should sit at. And it's also a good time to replace your lower ball joint, but we're going to take it to a alignment shop. We're going to have all the ball joints and bushing replaced, so we're going to hold off on that. So now we're going to install our lowering spring. Now the flat part of the spring goes up into the top pocket, and then the bottom part, there should be like the end of the spring that will slide into that little groove that I mentioned before. So right now you can rotate that spring if you need to, so that way you get the end of the spring into the end piece of that groove. And then we're going to use a floor jack to hold the lower control arm. As we jack up the lower control arm, we're going to line it up with the lower control arm ball joint into the steering knuckle and then put that back together. So again, we are going to replace this lower ball joint, and we are going to do all the bushings and the upper ball joints at the alignment shop. I just don't have the freaking tools or the time to do all this crap. So I know I got a lot of hate for that on Instagram, so I just want to mention that, make sure it's clear that we are replacing that stuff. So let me rotate this so you can see what we're doing. We're putting the nut back on there, and if you use a jack to push the lower control arm up into the steering arm, then you'll have enough pressure to where the ball joint won't spin as you tighten up the nut. So we're going to tighten up the nut, and we're going to put a new cotter pin in it. Once we get that bolted up, we're going to slide in the new shock from the bottom, and we're going to use the same mounting hose, but we're going to use new hardware. So we're going to move over to the driver's side. We already put the spring in, and then we're going to again use a floor jack to lift the lower control arm and the steering knuckle into the upper ball joint. And once we have enough pressure, we could put the nut and then tighten that down along with the new cotter pin. Then slide the new shock in there, hold the nut on top, put the bolt to the bottom, and then tighten these down. And then we're going to tap the top nut on the top of the shock. Don't forget to hold the centerpiece as you tighten up the nut. All right, so after that, now we're going to pull the box out that has the front and rear sway bars, and we're going to get those installed. So here is a front sway bar and the rear sway bar. And then you can see the old sway bar we're going to be swapping it out with. So on the sway bar end links, your sway bar will be mounted up to here, and then your lower control arm will mount it to here. So first thing we do is we're gonna install the sway bar link. So you'll have the bolt, a washer, a bushing. It goes through your lower control arm. Then you have another bushing and another washer. Then you have this solid piece. It's like a spacer. Then you have another washer, a bushing, your sway bar end, a bushing, a washer, and then you have a sway bar. So once we get both of the sway bar end links mounted up, we're gonna attach the sway bar to the frame. But first, we're gonna take our 15-minute break because we are a union and stuff, so we got rights. And on a side note, I'll be looking for a new assistant, so if anybody wants to apply, let me know. So now we're gonna zap in these brackets that hold the sway bar up to the frame. Quiet on the set, Bluey. So that's one of my kids, of course, being loud while I'm trying to film. So just a heads up, guys. Trying to make all this content and these how-to videos is time-consuming and takes a lot of time. So make sure you guys hit the like, share, and comment, and subscribe. That'll definitely help me out, and it's free. And if you guys want to show more support, here's the link to my website. There's a discount code now that I just made for you guys. So anything you buy is 10% off. So now we're going to move on to the rear sway bar, which was kind of a little tricky to put in. You got to kind of squeeze it in between the lower control arms. If you guys do buy merch off my website, make sure you follow my Instagram because from time to time, I'll be making a post and people that have the merch have a chance to win. So for example, I'll say, hey, anybody that tags me on a post wearing my merch at a Cars and Coffee wins $50. So the first person that does that will win. So make sure you guys follow my Instagram. So back to the sway bar. So the jack stands got in the way. So we had to jack up the rear end and then relocate the jack stands to the frame. And then once we did that, we were able to install the sway bar. So once we got the sway bar in place, we slid in all 4 bolts, 2 on each side. We tightened them up, and then we torqued them down to 45 foot-pounds. So that's it for this video, guys. On the next video, I will be installing the front hubs, bearing spacers, and the front Brembo 6-piston caliper. So make sure you guys subscribe and stay tuned for that. And as always, follow me on Instagrams where I post more often and I answer questions. And if you have specific questions, make sure you guys subscribe to my Instagram because I answer all questions in there. So I will see you guys in the next video.